Father-in-law mocked my failing restaurant, then his $1 million development needed my land. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Clara's small restaurant, casting delicate patterns across the worn wooden floors. She stood behind the counter, her hands busy arranging freshly baked pies on a display rack that had seen better days. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla mingled with the faint aroma of yesterday's coffee still lingering in the air. It was a modest place, but it carried her heart and soul. Every corner bore the imprint of years spent pouring herself into this dream. Her father-in-law, Richard, walked in unannounced as he often did, his polished leather shoes clicking against the floorboards like an unwelcome drumbeat. He didn't bother to greet her. Instead, his sharp eyes scanned the empty tables and chairs before settling on Clara with a smirk that made her stomach tighten. "Still here?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I thought by now you'd have realized this little hobby of yours isn't going anywhere." Clara forced a smile, though her jaw clenched beneath it. "It's not just a hobby, Richard. This is my business, my passion." Richard let out a derisive laugh, pulling out one of the mismatched chairs at the nearest table and sitting down without invitation. "Passion doesn't pay bills, Clara. Look around you, empty seats, peeling paint, a menu that hasn't changed in years. You're running yourself ragged for what? A handful of regulars who probably feel sorry for you." His words stung more than she cared to admit. She knew the restaurant wasn't thriving, not yet, but every day brought new lessons, new ideas, and a growing sense of purpose. Still, there was no denying the financial strain or the late nights spent worrying about how long she could keep the lights on. And Richard always seemed to find those cracks, prying them open until doubt seeped in. "You don't understand," she said quietly, turning back to the pies so he wouldn't see the tears welling up in her eyes. "This isn't just about money. It's about community, about creating something meaningful." "Oh, spare me the lecture," Richard interrupted, leaning forward with a patronizing grin. "Meaningful won't stop your landlord from raising the rent next month. Meaningful won't cover the repairs you need for that leaky roof. Face it, Clara, you're failing, and everyone knows it except you." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. Clara took a deep breath, willing herself not to cry in front of him. She had learned early on in her marriage that showing weakness only gave Richard more ammunition. Instead, she focused on the pie crust under her fingertips, smoothing it out with deliberate care. "Maybe I am struggling," she finally replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "But at least I'm trying to build something real. What have you ever created that mattered?" Richard's expression darkened, and for a split second, she thought she might have struck a nerve. But then he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug look that told her she hadn't won anything. "You want to talk about building something real? Fine. Let me show you what success looks like." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a glossy brochure, tossing it onto the counter like a challenge. Clara hesitated before picking it up, flipping it open to reveal sleek renderings of glass buildings, sprawling parks, and luxury condos. The headline screamed, "Riverside Renaissance, a $50 million vision for the future." "What is this?" she asked, frowning as she flipped through the pages. "This," Richard said, standing up and pointing to a map printed on the inside cover, "is my latest development project. It's going to transform this entire area into a hub of modern living. Upscale shops, restaurants, entertainment venues, all right here where these crumbling old buildings stand now." His tone shifted, becoming almost gleeful as he added, "including this dump." Clara froze, her fingers tightening around the brochure. "What are you talking about?" "The city council approved the plans last week," Richard explained, his grin widening. "We'll be buying out all the properties along this stretch of Main Street. Your little restaurant included." A cold wave of panic washed over her, but she refused to let it show. "You can't just bulldoze people's livelihoods because you think shiny skyscrapers are better," she shot back, her voice rising. "What about the families who live here? The businesses that have been part of this neighborhood for decades?" "They'll get compensated, of course," Richard said dismissively. "More than they deserve, if you ask me. But progress waits for no one, Clara. If you'd been smarter, if you'd invested in something worthwhile instead of wasting your time on this hopeless venture, you might have had a chance to join us. As it stands," he shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. Clara felt anger bubbling beneath her skin, hot and fierce. How dare he waltz in here, mocking everything she'd worked for, and then announce plans to tear it all down. But beneath the anger was fear, a deep, suffocating fear that maybe he was right. Maybe she had been foolish to hold on to this dream for so long. As if sensing her turmoil, Richard softened his tone slightly, adopting a faux concerned expression. Listen, Clara, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye. But I'm offering you a way out. Take the buyout, walk away with some cash in your pocket, and start fresh somewhere else. There's no shame in admitting defeat when the odds are stacked against you. Defeat. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. Was that what this was? Had she been fighting a losing battle all along? For a moment, she considered it, imagined walking away, leaving behind the stress and uncertainty. But then she glanced around the room, taking in the faded wallpaper she'd chosen herself, the hand-painted sign above the door, the photos of happy customers tacked haphazardly to the walls. This place wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And it meant something, to her, to the people who came here, to the community she loved. No, she said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. I'm not selling. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. When the bulldozers come rolling in, don't expect any favors. With that, he turned and strode toward the door, leaving the brochure behind like a ticking time bomb. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. Once the bell above the door jingled shut, signaling his departure, she sank onto a stool, clutching the edge of the counter for support. How had things gotten so bad? Just a few months ago, she'd been cautiously optimistic about the future. Sure, the restaurant wasn't raking in profits, but she'd been making connections, experimenting with new recipes, slowly building a loyal customer base. Now, faced with the prospect of losing everything, not just her business but her home, her identity, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She stared at the brochure again, flipping through its polished pages with growing dread. Each image of gleaming towers and manicured lawns felt like a personal attack, a reminder of everything she couldn't compete with. Yet amidst the despair, another emotion began to stir, determination. If Richard thought she would roll over and give up without a fight, he didn't know her at all. Over the next few days, Clara threw herself into action. She started by reaching out to other local business owners, many of whom were equally shocked and outraged by the development plans. Together, they formed a coalition, pooling resources and brainstorming ways to resist the takeover. They organized town hall meetings, circulated petitions, and reached out to journalists to raise awareness about the impact the project would have on the community. At first, Clara struggled to find her footing as a leader. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and she often found herself tongue-tied during interviews or debates. But with each passing day, she grew more confident, fueled by the stories of others who shared her plight. There was Maria, the elderly seamstress whose shop had been in her family for 3 generations, Tom, the mechanic who employed half a dozen teenagers from the neighborhood, and countless others whose lives were intertwined with the fabric of Main Street. Through it all, Richard remained a constant presence, hovering like a shadow. He attended the town hall meetings, attempting to charm skeptics with promises of jobs and economic growth. He sent representatives to negotiate buyouts, dangling increasingly large sums of money in front of desperate property owners. And whenever their paths crossed, he never missed an opportunity to remind Clara of her supposed failure. "You're wasting your time," he told her one evening after a particularly heated debate. "People like you always lose in the end. You think holding rallies and waving signs will change anything? This is capitalism, Clara. Survival of the fittest." His words cut deep, but they also ignited a fire within her. She realized that this fight wasn't just about saving her restaurant anymore, it was about proving him wrong. About showing him, and everyone else, that passion and perseverance could stand toe-to-toe with greed and power. As weeks turned into months, the battle intensified. Protests erupted outside City Hall, drawing national attention to the cause. Celebrities tweeted in support, local artists painted murals celebrating the spirit of Main Street, and grassroots fundraisers brought in donations from across the country. Clara became the face of the movement, her story inspiring countless others to stand up for what they believed in. But even as momentum grew, the pressure mounted. Legal battles drained her savings, sleepless nights left her exhausted, and the constant scrutiny took a toll on her mental health. More than once, she questioned whether she was doing the right thing, whether it was worth sacrificing so much for a dream that seemed impossible to achieve. Then, one crisp autumn morning, she received a letter that changed everything. It was from a lawyer representing a group of investors interested in revitalizing Main Street, not tearing it down. Their proposal involved partnering with existing businesses to create a sustainable community-focused model that preserved the area's unique character while attracting new customers and opportunities. Clara read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Could this be the lifeline she'd been praying for? Or was it too good to be true? Before she could decide, Richard appeared yet again, this time accompanied by a team of developers and city officials. They wanted to discuss terms, he explained, claiming that public opinion had forced them to reconsider their approach. Clara listened carefully, weighing their words against the promises in the letter. Something about their sudden change of heart didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't afford to ignore the possibility of compromise. As negotiations dragged on, tensions reached a boiling point. Betrayals surfaced, alliances fractured, and Clara found herself questioning whom she could trust. In the midst of the chaos, she discovered a secret that threatened to unravel everything, and revealed the true extent of Richard's schemes. With time running out and stakes higher than ever, Clara faced the ultimate test. Would she cling to her principles, even if it meant losing everything? Or would she make a deal with the devil to save what remained of her dream? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain: this fight was far from over. The discovery came late one night, as Clara sat hunched over a stack of documents at her kitchen table. The dim light from an overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her face. She had spent hours poring over legal papers, financial statements, and correspondence between Richard's development company and various city officials. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but something deep inside kept pushing her forward, a gut feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. It started with a single email buried in the annex of a public records request she'd filed weeks earlier. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, a routine update on zoning regulations sent by a junior planner in the city council. But nestled within the dense legalese was a name that made Clara's blood run cold: Victor Langley. She didn't recognize him immediately. It wasn't until she cross-referenced the name with another document, a list of major shareholders in Richard's development firm, that the pieces began to fall into place. Victor Langley wasn't just any shareholder, he was the CEO of a powerful real estate conglomerate known for its aggressive acquisitions and questionable ethics. And according to the email, he had been quietly lobbying the city council to fast-track approval for Richard's project months before it was officially announced. Clara's mind raced as she connected the dots. This wasn't just about turning Main Street into a playground for luxury condos and chain stores. This was part of something bigger, a coordinated effort to gentrify entire neighborhoods under the guise of urban renewal. What's worse, it appeared that Richard had deliberately withheld information about Victor's involvement, knowing full well how controversial his reputation was. Her hands trembled as she printed out copies of the incriminating documents. Part of her wanted to storm into Richard's office and confront him right then and there. But experience had taught her that rash actions rarely led to good outcomes. No, she needed proof, irrefutable evidence that could expose the truth and rally the community behind her cause. The next morning, Clara called an emergency meeting with the coalition. By now, they were a tight-knit group bound together by shared struggles and mutual respect. As she laid out the documents on the scarred wooden table of their makeshift headquarters, a converted storage room above Tom's auto shop, the room fell silent. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "This changes everything," Maria whispered, clutching her rosary beads tightly. "If people knew about this, if we can show them who's really pulling the strings." "But how do we prove it?" asked Tom, rubbing his temples. "These are just emails and names. They'll say it's hearsay or worse, accuse us of fabricating evidence." Clara nodded grimly. "We need someone credible to back us up. Someone who knows the inner workings of these deals, a whistleblower maybe." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. For several moments, no one spoke. Then from the back of the room, a young man raised his hand hesitantly. His name was Daniel, a college intern who had recently joined the coalition after hearing Clara speak at a rally. He looked nervous, almost guilty, as all eyes turned toward him. "I might know someone," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "My dad used to work for Victor Langley's company. He was fired last year after refusing to sign off on some shady contracts. Ever since, he's been trying to blow the whistle, but no one would listen." A spark of hope ignited in Clara's chest. "Do you think he'd talk to us?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around the room as if weighing his options.
Finally, he nodded. "I'll ask him. But you should know, he's scared. Really scared." "Who wouldn't be?"
Clara replied softly. "But sometimes fear is what drives people to do the bravest things." With Daniel's tentative agreement, the coalition sprang into action. While Clara prepared talking points and drafted press releases, others worked on securing a safe space where Daniel's father could share his testimony without fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, whispers of the new developments began spreading through the community, reigniting the passion that had fueled their protests in the early days. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, Clara felt a mix of anticipation and dread. They had arranged to meet at a secluded cabin outside town, owned by a retired teacher sympathetic to their cause. The drive there was quiet, each member lost in their own thoughts. Even the usually boisterous Tom seemed subdued, his usual bravado replaced by a somber determination. Inside the cabin, Daniel's father, Frank, waited for them, his weathered face lined with worry. He was older than Clara had expected, with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Despite his obvious nerves, there was a steely resolve in his eyes that gave Clara hope. "You're taking a big risk coming here," she said gently, offering him a cup of coffee.
"Thank you for trusting us."
Frank nodded, though his hands shook slightly as he accepted the mug. "I've seen what happens when people stay silent," he said, his voice gravelly but steady.
"I won't let them get away with this, not again."
Over the next few hours, Frank recounted stories that chilled them to the bone. He spoke of illegal evictions carried out under cover of darkness, bribes offered to corrupt officials, and entire communities displaced without so much as a second thought. Most damning of all, he revealed that Victor Langley's company had a history of targeting areas like theirs, places rich in culture and character but vulnerable due to economic instability. By the time Frank finished speaking, tears streamed down Maria's cheeks, and even Tom looked shaken. Clara, however, felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about saving Main Street anymore. It was about exposing a system designed to exploit the powerless and enrich the privileged few. And she was determined to bring it crashing down. Armed with Frank's testimony and the documents Clara had uncovered, the coalition launched a media blitz unlike anything the town had ever seen. Local news outlets picked up the story almost immediately, followed by national networks eager to capitalize on the growing outrage. Protesters flooded the streets once again, holding signs emblazoned with slogans like "Main Street Matters" and "No More Corporate Greed." Richard, predictably, went on the defensive. In a series of heated interviews, he dismissed the allegations as baseless smears orchestrated by jealous competitors. But the tide had already turned against him. Public opinion shifted rapidly, with even longtime supporters distancing themselves from his project. Still, Clara knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Richard's connections ran deep, and he wasn't above using every dirty trick in the book to protect his interests. She braced herself for whatever came next, knowing that the battle was far from over. One evening, as she locked up the restaurant after another long day of strategizing, she found Richard waiting for her outside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that set her on edge. "We need to talk," he said simply, stepping closer. Clara crossed her arms, steeling herself for whatever verbal assault he had planned.
"About what?"
"How you lied to everyone, including your own family." To her surprise, Richard didn't respond with anger. Instead, he sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair.
"You don't understand, Clara. I didn't have a choice."
"That's not true," she shot back, her voice rising.
"You always have a choice.
You chose greed over integrity, profit over people.
Don't try to justify it now."
For a moment, Richard looked genuinely conflicted. Then, as if shaking off an unwanted emotion, he straightened up and fixed her with a cold stare.
"Fine. Believe what you want.
But mark my words, if you keep digging, you'll only end up hurting yourself. And don't expect me to save you when the dust settles." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the fading light. She watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: she wouldn't back down.
Not now. Not ever.
As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Legal threats poured in, anonymous calls disturbed her nights, and cracks began to form within the coalition itself. Some members grew weary of the fight, tempted by offers of compensation that promised an easier life elsewhere. Others questioned whether they could truly win against opponents as ruthless as Richard and Victor. Yet amidst the chaos, Clara found strength she never knew she possessed. She rallied those who remained, reminding them why they had started this journey in the first place. Together, they forged ahead, united by a shared belief in justice and resilience. And then, just when it seemed like the odds might finally tip in their favor, a new player entered the game, one whose presence threatened to change everything. A mysterious investor reached out, offering not only to buy out Richard's stake in the project, but also to fund a revitalization plan that prioritized local businesses and affordable housing. At first, Clara was skeptical. Who was this benefactor, and what did they stand to gain? But as details emerged, she couldn't deny the potential impact such a partnership could have. Could this be the miracle they'd been praying for? Or was it yet another trap designed to undermine their efforts? Torn between hope and suspicion, Clara faced the most difficult decision of her life. Trust, or tread carefully? The answer would determine not only the fate of Main Street but also her own future. The mysterious investor's proposal arrived in the form of a sleek leather-bound folder delivered to Clara's restaurant one rainy afternoon. Inside were architectural renderings unlike anything she'd seen before, designs that preserved the charm of Main Street while incorporating modern elements like green spaces, solar panels, and community centers. The accompanying letter outlined a vision for sustainable development, emphasizing partnerships with existing businesses rather than displacing them. Clara stared at the documents, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, this plan seemed too good to be true, a lifeline thrown at the 11th hour, offering everything she'd fought for without requiring further sacrifice. On the other hand, skepticism gnawed at her. Who was this benefactor? And why had they chosen now, when the battle was at its most precarious, to step forward? She called an emergency meeting with the coalition, spreading out the materials on the same scarred table where they'd gathered countless times before. As everyone leaned in to examine the plans, reactions ranged from cautious optimism to outright distrust. "It's brilliant," Maria murmured, tracing a finger over the sketches of a renovated market square. "This is exactly what we've been fighting for." "But who is this person?" Tom demanded, his voice gruff with suspicion. "No one just swoops in with millions of dollars and zero strings attached. What's their angle?" "That's what worries me," Clara admitted, rubbing her temples. "I want to believe this is legitimate, but after everything we've been through, how can we trust them?" Daniel spoke up hesitantly, his youthful face etched with concern. "Maybe it doesn't matter who they are. If they're willing to help us save Main Street, isn't that enough?" "It matters," Clara said firmly. "Trust has to be earned. We've already seen what happens when people operate in the shadows." Determined to get answers, Clara arranged a meeting with the investor's representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn who exuded confidence and competence. Dressed in a tailored suit, Evelyn greeted Clara with a warm smile and extended her hand. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Evelyn began, her tone polished yet sincere. "I understand your reservations, and I assure you, transparency is our priority." Clara didn't return the smile. "Then start by telling me who you work for." Evelyn nodded, unfazed by Clara's directness. "My employer prefers to remain anonymous for now, but I can tell you this, they're deeply invested in revitalizing underserved communities. They saw what you've accomplished here, the resilience, the unity, and they wanted to support it." "That still doesn't explain why they waited until now to step in," Clara pressed. "Why not earlier, when we could have used their help?" Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. "To be honest, they weren't aware of the situation until recently. When they learned about the grassroots movement you led, they were inspired. But they also knew timing was critical. Coming in too soon might have undermined your efforts or made it seem like charity. Now though, you've proven yourselves capable of standing up to powerful forces. That's something my employer respects." Clara studied Evelyn's face, searching for any hint of deception. For all her professionalism, there was an earnestness in her eyes that resonated with Clara. Still, trust wasn't something she could afford to give lightly. "What's the catch?" Clara asked bluntly. "There's always a catch." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You're right to ask. There's no hidden agenda here, but there are conditions. My employer wants to ensure that the revitalization stays true to the community's values. That means local input will guide every decision, and profits generated by new developments will be reinvested into affordable housing and small business grants.
And what about Richard? Clara asked, her voice tight with anger. Does he know about this? Evelyn's expression darkened slightly. Let's just say his role is being reassessed.
His actions during this process have raised serious concerns, both legally and ethically.
Rest assured, he won't be involved moving forward.
Clara felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought of Richard losing control, but it was tempered by lingering doubts. Could she really accept help from someone whose identity remained shrouded in mystery? Yet, as she looked around the room later that evening, watching the coalition debate the proposal, she realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about her or even Main Street, it was about proving that progress didn't have to come at the expense of integrity. In the end, Clara decided to take the leap, not blindly, but with clear boundaries. She insisted on clauses ensuring accountability, including regular audits and public forums to monitor the project's progress. To her surprise, Evelyn agreed without hesitation, reinforcing Clara's growing belief that this might actually work. As construction began, the transformation of Main Street unfolded in ways Clara never imagined. Her restaurant became a cornerstone of the revitalized district, attracting visitors from across the region while remaining a haven for locals. Maria's sewing shop expanded into a boutique showcasing handmade goods, and Tom's garage transformed into a community hub offering free car repair workshops for teens. Through it all, Clara often found herself reflecting on the journey. She thought about the nights spent doubting herself, the battles fought against seemingly insurmountable odds, and the relationships forged in the heat of adversity. Most of all, she thought about Richard, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of vindication. He had underestimated her, dismissed her dreams as naive, and tried to crush her spirit. But in doing so, he had only strengthened her resolve. One crisp spring morning, as sunlight streamed through the newly installed stained glass windows of her restaurant, Clara received a final piece of the puzzle. A letter arrived, unsigned but unmistakably from the anonymous benefactor. It contained a single sentence. Sometimes, the greatest victories come from those brave enough to refuse defeat. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer alongside the faded brochure Richard had left behind all those months ago. Together, they served as reminders of where she'd been and how far she'd come. That evening, as she stood outside watching families stroll down the bustling street, laughter ringing in the air, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. Main Street had survived, not because of luck or charity, but because of the collective strength of a community unwilling to let go of its soul. And as she turned to lock up her restaurant for the night, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Against all odds, she had built something real. Something meaningful. Something that would endure long after the headlines faded and the dust settled. Her father-in-law's mocking words echoed faintly in her memory, but now they carried no sting. Instead, they fueled her gratitude, for the fight, for the lessons, and for the unshakable truth that passion, perseverance, and purpose could move mountains.